The train rattled down the tracks, cutting through the dense forest under a moonless night. Claire, a seasoned traveler, settled into her seat, enjoying the solitude of the nearly empty carriage. It was the last train of the night, and the only sound was the rhythmic clattering of the wheels against the steel rails. As the train sped deeper into the wilderness, Claire noticed a peculiar sensation, a creeping chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She pulled her coat tighter around her, but the cold persisted, gnawing at her nerves. The lights in the carriage flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Claire tried to shake off the unease, attributing it to fatigue. She had been traveling all day and was eager to reach her destination. Suddenly, the train lurched to a stop in the middle of nowhere. There was no station, no sign of civilization, just the dark, impenetrable forest outside. Claire looked around, hoping to see a conductor or another passenger, but the carriage was empty. Panic set in. She stood up and made her way to the front of the train, her footsteps echoing in the silence. As she moved through the carriages, she saw no one, no conductor, no passengers. The train was utterly deserted. The cold intensified and Claire's breath fogged in the air. She reached the driver's cabin only to find it locked. She banged on the door, calling out, but there was no response. Just as she was about to give up, the door creaked open on its own. The cabin was empty, the controls unmanned. The only sign of life was a faint, old-fashioned melody playing from a crackling radio. It was an old tune, one Claire vaguely recognized from childhood, something her grandmother used to hum. Confusion and fear twisted in her gut as she grabbed the radio, trying to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The train suddenly jerked forward, throwing her off balance. The lights flickered again, plunging the train into darkness for a few seconds. When the lights returned, the cabin was different. It looked older, more worn, as though decades had passed in those few moments of darkness. Claire stumbled back into the passenger carriage, her heart pounding. The train had changed. Now it looked like something from a bygone era. The seats were tattered, the walls grimy, and the windows caked with dirt. Even the air felt different, stale, musty, and heavy with decay. And then she saw them, passengers. They were seated, staring straight ahead, their faces pale and lifeless. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen them before, but now the carriage was full. The people looked strange, their clothes outdated by decades, their eyes hollow and sunken. They didn't move, didn't blink. They just sat there, as if waiting for something. Claire tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She backed away, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone, desperate to call for help. But the screen was dead, showing only static. The train's speed increased, the forest outside whizzing by in a blur. The passengers remained motionless, their dead eyes fixed on nothing. She had to get off the train. Claire rushed to the nearest exit, trying to pry the door open, but it wouldn't budge. She pounded on the windows, screaming for help, but the glass was unyielding. The train hurtled forward faster and faster, the landscape outside becoming a dark smear. Suddenly, a voice crackled over the train's intercom, distorted and eerie. Next stop, the final stop. Claire's blood ran cold. She turned to face the passengers, who now slowly began to move. Their heads turned in unison, their empty eyes locking onto her. They rose from their seats, their movements slow and mechanical. Claire stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet as they advanced toward her. Desperation clawed at her as she scrambled to her feet, running back toward the driver's cabin. The door slammed shut behind her, and she locked it, her hands shaking. The melody from the radio had changed, now a haunting lullaby that filled the cabin with a sense of dread. Claire's mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was nowhere to go. The train began to slow, the screeching of the brakes filling the air. Claire dared to hope that maybe it was a real station this time, that maybe she could escape. But as the train came to a halt, she looked out the grimy window and saw nothing but an endless void of darkness. The doors slid open with a hiss, but there was no platform, no lights, only the abyss. The passengers outside the cabin began to claw at the door, their faces pressing against the glass, their mouths moving in silent screams. Claire backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She was trapped. Then the driver's cabin door opened on its own. There was no one there, just the dark void outside. The melody from the radio grew louder, drowning out her thoughts, pulling her toward the door. Claire tried to resist, but her body moved on its own, her feet dragging her closer to the gaping darkness. As she reached the edge, she felt an icy hand grip her shoulder. She turned around to see one of the passengers, a young girl with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. The girl whispered in a voice that sent shivers down Claire's spine. "It's your stop." With a final scream, Claire was pulled into the darkness, swallowed by the void. The train, now empty once more, resumed its journey through the night. The radio crackled again, the same haunting lullaby playing as it traveled endlessly, searching for its next passenger. Beware of journeys taken in solitude, for the paths you tread might lead you to destinations unknown, where escape is but an illusion, and the final stop may be your last. In the winter of 2018, a young woman named Alice boarded the midnight train from New York to Boston. The cold wind howled outside as the train departed from Penn Station, and the old carriages creaked with every turn. The train was mostly empty, save for a few weary travelers scattered in various compartments. Alice, tired from a long day, found a quiet corner and settled into her seat, planning to sleep through the journey. As the train chugged along, she noticed something strange. The lights flickered, and the train seemed to lose power for brief moments, plunging the car into darkness. When the lights returned, the car was eerily quiet. The occasional hum of the train on the tracks was the only sound, but there was an unsettling feeling in the air, as if something was watching her. Alice tried to shake off her unease and closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, her mind wandered back to a story she had heard years ago about this very train line. Legend had it that a train on this route had mysteriously disappeared one winter night in the 1950s. The train was never found, and neither were its passengers. Locals believed the train had slipped into another dimension, a purgatory for lost souls, forever trapped between worlds. As the hours passed, Alice began to feel increasingly uneasy. The train seemed to be slowing down, but when she looked out the window, the scenery outside was pitch black. There were no lights, no signs of civilization, just an endless void. She checked her watch. It was 2:30 a.m., and they should have been nearing the halfway point by now. Feeling a growing sense of dread, Alice decided to explore the train. She moved through the carriages, finding them all empty. The passengers she had seen earlier were nowhere to be found. Even the conductor and staff seemed to have vanished. Panic set in, and she quickened her pace, calling out for anyone who might still be on board. But her calls were met with silence, echoing eerily in the empty corridors. As she reached the end of one carriage, she saw a door that hadn't been there before. It was old, with peeling paint and a rusted handle. Despite every instinct telling her to turn back, Alice felt compelled to open it. She twisted the handle, and the door creaked open to reveal a dimly lit, narrow passageway that led downward into the belly of the train. With no other option, she descended the steep steps, the air growing colder with each step. The passage led to a hidden compartment, unlike anything she had seen before. It was filled with old, decaying seats, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. At the far end of the compartment, she noticed a group of figures huddled together. As Alice approached, she realized they were passengers, but something was horribly wrong. Their skin was pale and lifeless, their eyes hollow, and they stared ahead as if in a trance. She called out to them, but they didn't respond. It was as if they were frozen in time, caught in a perpetual loop of misery. Suddenly, one of the passengers turned to her, his eyes locking onto hers. His voice was a rasping whisper as he spoke. "We're trapped. We've been here for decades, and now you are too. The train doesn't reach its destination. It never does." Alice stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to flee, but the passageway behind her had disappeared. The walls of the compartment seemed to close in on her, the air growing colder and heavier. She could feel her own body beginning to stiffen, the same lifelessness creeping into her limbs. Desperation took over, and she fought against the invisible force holding her. With every ounce of strength, she sprinted towards the exit, her vision blurring as the compartment twisted and distorted around her. Just as she felt herself slipping into the same frozen state as the other passengers, she burst through the door, collapsing onto the cold floor of the carriage above. The lights flickered back on, and the train jolted to life, speeding up as if nothing had happened. Alice gasped for air, her body trembling from the ordeal. She looked around and saw that the other passengers had reappeared, oblivious to the horror she had just experienced. They were sleeping peacefully, unaware of the nightmare lurking just below their feet. As the train pulled into Boston, Alice hurried off, her mind racing. She knew she had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. The legend was true. The train was a vessel for lost souls, doomed to ride the rails for eternity. But why had it let her go? She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that it was only a matter of time before the train came for her again. Months later, Alice moved to a new city, far away from train lines, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But every night, she was haunted by the sound of a distant train whistle, echoing through the darkness. She knew it was calling for her, and she knew that one day, she wouldn't be able to resist its pull. Some journeys are not meant to be taken, and curiosity can lead us down paths from which there is no return. Trains had always been a symbol of connection, of progress, of journeys undertaken. But for those who had heard the whispers about the Midnight Express, it was also a symbol of something far darker. Ella had always been skeptical of ghost stories. A rational mind, she worked as a journalist for a regional newspaper, often debunking myths and legends in her column. So, when her editor assigned her to cover the alleged hauntings of the Midnight Express, she accepted with a smirk. This train was said to appear only on the nights of a new moon, running through the most desolate and forgotten tracks, picking up passengers who were never seen again. Determined to prove the story wrong, Ella set out for the old station, where the Midnight Express was last spotted. The station, now abandoned and decrepit, had a history of its own. It was once a bustling hub, but after a horrific accident that claimed dozens of lives, it was left to decay. The night was cold, and the wind howled through the cracked windows of the station as Ella waited. Midnight approached, and with it, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the world around her. Her breath quickened, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into her mind. Then, she heard it, the distant, mournful whistle of a train. The ground trembled slightly beneath her feet, and the tracks began to hum. The sound grew louder, and through the fog, the silhouette of a train emerged, its form shimmering like a mirage. The Midnight Express had arrived. Ella hesitated, but her journalistic instincts pushed her forward. She had to see for herself. As she approached the train, she noticed its windows were dark, and the air around it was unnaturally cold. The door creaked open, inviting her in. Against her better judgment, she stepped inside. The interior was unlike any train she had ever seen. The seats were lined with crimson velvet, and the walls were adorned with ornate, old-world decorations. But the passengers, they were strange. They sat still, almost too still, dressed in clothing from different eras, their eyes vacant and lifeless. Ella's heart pounded in her chest as she made her way down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. She tried to speak to one of the passengers, but they remained unresponsive, their gaze fixed on something far away. As she reached the end of the carriage, she noticed a man standing by the door. He was tall, with a thin, gaunt face, his eyes deep-set and hollow. He wore a conductor's uniform, but it was frayed and covered in dust, as if it had been untouched for years. "Welcome aboard, miss," he said in a voice that sent chills down her spine. "I hope you're prepared for the journey." Before Ella could respond, the train lurched forward, and the world outside the windows blurred into darkness. Panic surged through her as she realized there was no turning back. She was trapped on the Midnight Express. The train sped through the night, passing through landscapes that defied logic. Forests of twisted, blackened trees, mountains that seemed to be made of shadows, and rivers of blood-red water. The passengers remained motionless, their expressions frozen in a mix of fear and despair. Ella tried to open the door to escape, but it was locked tight. The conductor appeared beside her, his eyes gleaming with something sinister. "There's no leaving, miss," he whispered. "The Midnight Express only takes you where you need to go." "Where is that?" Ella demanded, her voice trembling. He smiled, a cold, hollow smile, to your final destination. Desperation took hold of Ella as she frantically searched for a way out. But the train seemed to stretch on endlessly, each carriage filled with more lost souls, their stories untold, their fates sealed. The air grew heavier, suffocating, and Ella felt her strength waning. Then she saw it, a door at the very end of the last carriage, slightly ajar. A glimmer of hope sparked within her, and she rushed towards it. But as she reached for the handle, the conductor's hand clamped down on her shoulder, his grip like iron. "You can't escape your fate," he hissed, his voice echoing through the carriage. But Ella was determined. With all the strength she could muster, she broke free from his grasp and threw open the door. Blinding light flooded in, and for a moment she thought she had made it. She was free. But as the light faded, Ella found herself back in the same carriage, the same passengers staring blankly ahead, the conductor standing beside her, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. "There's no escape," he said softly, "not from the Midnight Express." Realization dawned on Ella, and a cold dread settled in her bones. She was just another passenger now, doomed to ride the Midnight Express for all eternity, never reaching her destination, never finding peace. The train continued its journey through the night, the sound of its whistle echoing in the void, a haunting melody of despair. And somewhere far away, the old station remained silent, waiting for the next lost soul to board the Midnight Express. Not every journey can be controlled, and some paths lead to destinations from which there is no return. When curiosity leads to defiance of the unknown, one might find themselves trapped in the very darkness they sought to disprove.